So first I will introduce Aleszu Bajak. He and I worked together briefly at USA Today, which was a pleasure. He's the senior data reporter with the investigative team there. He was also an MIT Knight Science Journalism Fellow. He worked at Undark Magazine, Esquire. He's taught journalism at Northeastern and was a founder of both storybench.org and latinamericascience.org. And he's just brilliant and great to work with. And I'm going to hand it over to Aleszu to start.
Great. Okay. Well, hi, everybody. And I will drop a link into the chat so you all can see this and kind of go along with me if I can find the chat. You know, it's funny, like right when COVID started, it was my last class teaching at Northeastern and it went fully virtual and it was a headache. And I think I did the worst ever because I couldn't even, you know, find Zoom controls. Okay, so this is what I'm going to put up here. Can everyone see my screen? Yes, okay, I see Sergio, so here we go. Okay, so I'm gonna just go I'm gonna talk about kind of data collection, data analysis, and maybe a little bit on kind of presentation tips and things that I've found through the years, and then kind of pass it off to my great colleagues and panelists here to kind of pick up the baton and continue. But a little preface from me. So I was a scientist. I was a gene therapy bench scientist for a few years right out of college before I transitioned to journalism. My dad's a longtime AP reporter, grew up around the world following him. And after science, kind of started to kind of do a bunch of science journalism. So that was my gateway into journalism. And then after like 10 years of science reporting, I fell in love with data, kind of realized that someone reading science papers was pretty well kind of attuned and familiar with data. And so kind of have been doing that for the last 2 years. So what I hope to do is kind of give you all a sense of how I find, analyze, bulletproof, and present data. And I'm going to do this fairly quickly because you have that doc there that kind of explains some of my thinking that I'll be going through here. But you know, I think everyone does this with any kind of creative process, right? The kind of ideation phase, the conceptualization phase. And, you know, this is something I learned at Northeastern in teaching this. I had to basically, teach myself data journalism to then go teach it to the students, right, at this grad school. And that's how I fell in love with it, because I was looking kind of far and wide. I was looking at the Information is Beautiful awards. I was looking at what computational social scientists were doing. I was looking at obviously kind of what 538 and the Upshot were doing. That was inspiring. But what I really loved was the English PhDs who were learning how to build maps and networks, the historians that were building animations, right? That kind of stuff really that sold me on the power of data and data visualization to tell stories. And so then I kind of backfilled and tried to understand how I could apply that to things on shorter deadlines than a dissertation or a book, and tried to learn as quickly as I could. So a few things I just want to make a point of here. Look far and wide, kind of, if you see something that's inspiring that you may be able to swap in your question or your data set, kind of log that, right? Bank that example. It's great. It kind of, if it's a visual, let's say, exploration of something like police body camera footage in an interesting way, like a timeline. You know, think of ProPublica and the January 6th Parler presentation that they did. Is that something that you could then swap in your own ideas? Research and interview phase, obviously, you know, given the timeline, depending on the project, I tend to do lots of kind of background, almost, you know, conceptualization interviews just to run the thesis by a couple experts, right? You I'm sure do that, but in the same way with a data story, I'm constantly doing that right up front, even before I've brought the pitch to my editor, which is just like, hey, look, no one's actually done this before. The political scientists are sitting on this data set and no one's kind of covered it in the media. We really should be doing something with this. And oh, by the way, I've already talked to 2 of them and they're totally game to give us all the metadata, right? Extra columns that's not even available on their website, right? That kind of work is what the kind of the speccing out with data. And I think that translates also to FOIAs. Do a lot of requests for very specific kinds of spreadsheets, right? If you can dream it, I heard this at a data journalism conference years ago. Someone was like, what's your dream CSV, right? Your CSV is like a spreadsheet. And I thought it was hilarious and nerdy. But if you think about it, maybe you want something that's like, hey, by state, by program, by year, right? Wouldn't that be cool to make a request of every state and try to get that breakdown, right? Or if, or maybe there's a think tank or someone who's put out a report and it may not have made it into the final report, but if you talk to the data analyst at the think tank, they may be sitting on that spreadsheet and save you weeks and weeks and weeks of work. So I like to think about what's the kind of ultimate structure sometimes of the data set that I'm looking for or I'm looking to build. And then obviously I collect and structure. So once you start to dream in spreadsheets, although I don't think I've actually had a dream of a spreadsheet yet, but everything basically is kind of organized in spreadsheets for me nowadays. And so collecting and structuring that. So if I'm looking at, a literature review, a coverage review, who's covered this in the media, who's studied this? I like to say, we may be spending a couple weeks on this. Academics may have spent 2 decades on this. Let's go find that academic who's a super expert in this one little thing. And generally you can find them.
You might want to just hop into like full display mode just so that we can see this all a little bit bigger.
Sure. Sorry about that.
No, that's great. Thanks.
And then obviously we can save questions for later or whatever it is. And ping me anytime. Like I'm down to talk about this stuff. If you can tell, I love talking about this stuff. So then the next phase, the analysis phase, there's any number of tutorials and kind of help out there. If you want to get kind of a little nitty gritty in the Excel, there may be someone in your newsroom who can help. But I think there's nothing better than just plopping it into like Google Sheets or Excel and just taking it for a spin yourself. I literally do like the 4 corners test first, right? Where I zoom over to like the rightmost column, the bottommost row, the leftmost column, the topmost row, right? Just get a sense of like, okay, well, what is this thing? And now Google Sheets, for instance, has this great explore function where you can kind of quickly generate what's the average, what's the minimum, what's the maximum. Go ahead through those kinds of steps just to familiarize yourself. And then what I'm always doing is translating whatever that number is into a sentence, right? How would I translate this into text? And getting into the habit of that really helps you communicate with your editors and obviously with your readers what those numbers mean and the context of them, right? Given this data set or for only this time period, the average X was X, right? I do a lot of really quick visualizations. Not everyone kind of wants to do this. There are a lot of off-the-shelf tools now where you can kind of drop a spreadsheet in. One of my favorite ones is raw graphs, built by the Politecnico di Milano in Italy. It's a beautiful, drag and drop visualization engine, free online, where you can just kind of start to play with things like this. You can build a bee swarm in like 5 seconds. That's what that little kind of guitar-shaped visualization is. It kind of helps me understand kind of where these data are segregating, like by state or by group, by year. It really helps me kind of start my questions on the data set before I kind of know, okay, well, what I really want to do is summarize by this kind of group, right, or by this year. I take a detailed like code notebook, so down the bottom left here, where I say, okay, here's where the data is from, the URL. Many times these URLs get deprecated, like they get cut off. I would urge you to save those, whatever it is, a spreadsheet or a PDF or whatever it is you're pulling this from, to your local computer. Have a good kind of file naming structure. I have it basically by project, and then inside that directory you have the data folder and then your kind of analysis folder. But I write out my steps, And if I'm doing it, especially at the beginning when I was learning this stuff, I was saving things into new spreadsheets every time so that I could retrace my steps. So if I was going to filter by, okay, I want everything since 2010, I would filter it and then I would export that and save it as a new spreadsheet and be like, since 2010.xls, so that I had a kind of, I could retrace my steps. I included this right here with a narrate over time, these archetypes of data journalism. The one on the left is from Tableau, the one on the right, the novelty outlier archetype. This from Andrew Flowers, who used to be at 538. And I like these two because if you're kind of ever thinking, oh, what could I do with, what kind of data story could I do given this data set or with this question? What kind of data angle could I find to a question on political ads or something? Well, what if I kind of chose one of these? This is kind of like a quick a cheat sheet to figuring out what kind of data angle you could take on something. And then the other data angle that I find and do in almost every one of my stories is, okay, just because I have a data set like from Bureau of Labor Statistics, I am not just going to kind of publish something directly on that, right? I know that, especially given my time frame, I'm not writing anything breaking on that. I have a week or two or a month or two to say, well, what could I merge this with, right? Like, what's interesting at the intersection of, say, this BLS data and some other data set? So always be thinking about how you can kind of merge and enhance the story, like add, obviously, context that our readers would love. And then bulletproofing. So one time a colleague, so Jeff Howe, he's now at Northeastern, used to be at Wired, was a Neiman Fellow, and a great friend. He said, you need a rabbi for every story. And I was like, a rabbi? What are you talking about? And he was like, you need someone who can hold your hand through the process. And if it's a kind of heavy science story, if a heavy data story, kind of anything, or a heavy kind of, theory, right? You want someone who's just such an expert in this, but also willing to give you their time. And I'm sure you guys all know this for the stories that you all report. But for data, I've found in the last few years, a ton of people who are just so open and giving with their time. So a lot of scientists, doctors, academic researchers, and then people in industry too, less so, who are just like, sure, send me the data. Oh yeah, look at this graph. Well, what if you kind of substituted this in? Or wait, are you sure you're using this model correctly? You should try this one. And what they can do is, they don't just say, I don't like it, move on. That's not a helpful rabbi. I want the person who's going to guide me to, hey, this literature has kind of really kind of proven X. So why don't you use the methods that they've used, right? And so that makes total sense to me. I mean, our practice and the data journalism that I love is kind of rooted in empiricism and the scientific method, right? I'm not just going to find a data set and publish it, right? If I'm going to try to answer a question, I'm going to borrow from my time at the bench, right, as a scientist, and say, okay, well, this is rooted along a continuum of research in this particular field. How do I make sure? And this is weird, but I don't want to necessarily just satisfy the readers. I also want to satisfy the people who have been spending decades of their lives studying this thing. I want to make sure that I get it right for them too. And along those points, I'm doing a lot of, I'm very careful, right? I'm very careful not to imply that anything has a causal link, right? I'm sure you've heard the correlation does not equal causation mantra. Definitely true. And definitely, especially folks getting into data journalism run the risk, I think, of jumping to those kinds of conclusions, right? About something, especially when politics gets involved. We are humans. We love to categorize things, right? Speaking of nonfiction books, Liliana Mason's writings are awesome on political science and tribalism and these kinds of things. But that field is rife with over-categorization, right? And simplifying narratives. And the media, I think, is very prone to that. with data and with you standing in as the more kind of cautious reviewer of that analysis, I would urge you to push back against editors that want to simplify or change the language, the conservative and careful language that your analysis has kind of concluded, to not necessarily write the headline in that way or write the lead in that way, right? Let's be careful. I think that our readers and and the people that study this will appreciate that more.
Thank you, LSU.
yeah.
I think that's really good advice. I also just want to remind folks that if you want to pick his brain about anything that you're working on, feel free to do that too. I'm volunteering you for everything.
Hi, Aleszu. My name's Gabriel. I work for CNBC. Thank you so much. My ears perked up when you talked about the BLS data and cross-tabbing that with other stuff, because I usually just run the BLS data straight. But I wanted to ask you about your process in terms of editing yourself when it comes to visual elements. How much is too much? Do you have a checklist that you refer to when you want to make sure you're not getting ahead of yourself with just throwing data viz vomit on a web page? And then I have a follow-up to that if there's time, but
Yeah,
I'll save that for later.
Well, yeah, I mean, I keep thinking it depends. Like if I were, let's say, doing, and like 538 had a lot of those data stories where it was like 5 charts and 5 blurbs in text. Like we don't really, like at USA Today, we don't really run those kinds of a 5-element data story. But like many of my drafts to my editor or to a team that I'm collaborating with might actually be broken down that way. And then we end up pruning 3 of those out of there, right? So I like presenting it almost, what I literally will do is I'll open up a keynote presentation, and as I'm reporting out and kind of researching, I'll throw my conclusions, my visualizations with some almost publish ready narrative to go with them. And then when we meet as a collaborative team, I'll be like, oh, hey, let me take you for a spin through this. This is the way that I've thought about breaking this data down. I did this with schools and COVID, right? Schools and kids. So it was me and then the education team. And then we ended up dropping a couple of those. Graphics was with us from the get-go. But I actually ended up building those graphics and they were really simple. But it was cool to have those options early so that we could decide, no, let's not go with a map. Let's actually just go with kind of comparative line charts. But I had those options. Does that make sense?
It makes complete sense, and it makes me feel a lot better because I'm usually just I'm a line chart person. I usually go very simple, and I almost feel bad because there's so much other crap out there that you could put on.
Yeah, but simple works, right? Simple works. I mean, look at the Laz Gamio had that spiral chart, right? And everyone freaked out, and it's well, it made me think hey, year 3 of the pandemic, I think maybe we do need to shock people into thinking differently about these numbers that we're hitting them over the head with, day over day. But at the same time, there were a lot of cons to that kind of a spiral diagram. Namely, it really just showed seasonality of the virus. It didn't necessarily show anything else, but that's fine. So I love having those discussions. And in the end, we end up just going with simple. And I think it's a real kind of what's our responsibility to readers? And what I said to my colleagues was I'm not here to placate the Twitterati. I'm here to communicate these numbers to our readers and to America. I don't care what Nate Silver's tweeting.
So hi, I'm Annette. I'm a data graphics journalist at Politico, and I'm just curious if some of the most compelling and the stories that you're most proud of were based on data that was really hard to get, you waited years for on FOIAs, or if it was publicly available data. Just curious.
I try to be proud of everything that I do, right? And that means that sometimes if it's a quick turn thing, I'm really proud that we turned around something in a week that just took a left turn when the herd was going right. Everyone was doing it with this, or I'm proud when we get a map out before the Times does, right? Like, you know, I'm proud of those kinds of things. But yeah, I mean, you know, sure, like it was limited. Like, so an example is Minnesota and Michigan were like 5 out of the 50 states gave me detailed COVID vaccination data, right? And that was like that example of the request in my presentation, where I'd asked everyone for vaccination, like 1 row per person vaccinated. And you can imagine, like, you know, most of the states ghosted me. I still have outstanding FOIAs for like 10 of those states. And but the 2 that I got comparable data sets on, I was able to publish something on. And I'm pretty proud of that, because it was like I had the luxury of time, like my editor, you know, USAC gave me that time. And at least the researchers, you know, the folks that are really interested in kind of public health and inequities, really kind of, I love the feedback from them. But I don't think I didn't get much feedback from readers. I don't think it did that well, quote unquote. But I was really happy with it. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, hi, I'm Madison from Insider. Yeah, are there any data sets that you think are particularly underused or underutilized to use in reporting or visualizing, et cetera?
I don't know. I don't have like a wish list of like ones I want to be using. You know, I think here's something that I've been like excited about lately is like, and especially for you, the folks that cover politics, is like, there's so many vendors knocking around DC, right? And they're vendors that like media does not interact with. Maybe they would never even share with us, but maybe we haven't even asked. But data that like kind of, you know, makes lobbying and makes politics works. I'm interested in those data sets. Like, what is the secret sauce that those folks have built a business model on top of? It may get us thinking also about how we can build our own data sets and models on top of data sets. The other thing I wanted to say was, you know, Jeremy Singer Vine has that Data is Plural newsletter. And I love looking through that. You can go get the spreadsheet, he links to it on TinyLetter, of like everything he's ever shared on that newsletter. And reading through those entries, it just gives me ideas, like I was talking about with inspiration or the Reuters stuff. Like, I see something that's been done on like democracy scoring around the world. And I say, well, you know, who's doing that for states? And then that gets me onto the rabbit hole of some kind of a, you know, a Moody's state by state or something like that. So yeah, I hope that makes sense.